Yeah.
Okay. Year 10, this is a video to help you with your work on sources of wisdom and authority. And we've been starting to look with the home learning tasks on why Jesus is a good example for Catholics to follow when they're making decisions and in their everyday life. Now, as you'll remember, Jesus is fully God and fully human. That's from John's Gospel. This means that Jesus is God incarnate. Now, if Jesus is God incarnate, that means he's fully God and he's fully human. And if we're thinking about why Jesus is a good example for people to follow today, he shows us exactly what God is like, therefore shows us what God wants us to do, and he shows us how to be the perfect human. And if he's human, that means he's a realistic example for us to follow. So because Jesus is the incarnation of God, that means that he's a really good example to follow. Now, there are different things you need to know. Firstly, Jesus helped us to understand the law. Now, if you think back to sort of Judaism topic start of this year, you'll remember that in Judaism, in the Old Testament, there's lots and lots of commandments. In fact, there's 613 commandments. And this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the law. Now, the most important of those 613 commandments is the 10 commandments, which you'll remember are split into 4 and 6. 4 of them are to do with how we treat God, and 6 of them are to do with how we treat others. Now, these 10 commandments, you remember, are also known as the Decalogue. Now, what Jesus did was he came to help us understand what all this meant. And Jesus said that we need to simplify this. We need to not get bogged down with all this fine detail. And really, what God wants is us to love God and to love our neighbour. That's ultimately what all this was about. If you think of it, 4 commandments about God and 6 about others. Jesus comes and explains that God wants us to behave in 2 main ways. He wants us to show love to God and show love to our neighbour. Now, he kind of explained this in a lot of detail in something really important called the Sermon on the Mount. Now, this was one of Jesus's kind of biggest and most famous speeches, and it was really where he explained a new kind of morality. It was where he kind of explained how we could build God's kingdom. It was where he was getting to grips with what does God actually want from us. And on the Sermon on the Mount, he explains this idea to love God and love your neighbour. And he kind of sums it up with what we now call as the Golden Rule, which is to treat others as you would like to be treated. Don't do to other people what you wouldn't like done to yourself. Do unto others that you would like done unto you. And what he says on the Sermon on the Mount is this idea of loving God and loving our neighbour and treating other people as we would like to be treated. He says, there is no greater commandment than these. And this is from Matthew. So the Sermon on the Mount is written about in Matthew's Gospel. These are the most important commandments. Yes, this is important from the Old Testament, but this is really the crux of it. This is what it all means. Love God and love your neighbour. Now, we might need a little bit more detail on how God wants us to behave and looking at the example of Jesus. And he kind of explains it a little bit more about how we can love our neighbour, and how we can kind of work for what we would call social justice, and helping those in need. So remember, we're looking at why Jesus is a good example of how we should behave today. So he spoke a lot about helping people in need. And one of the main things he spoke about was helping those who were suffering. And he speaks about this in the parable of the sheep and the goats. Now remember, in parables, there's a lot of symbolism. And in the parable of the sheep and the goats, there's my sheep, and here's my goat. These sheep and these goats represent different things. In the story, the sheep and the goats are split from each other based on how they've behaved. And what Jesus says is that we must treat everyone as if they were Jesus. And he kind of explains this in different examples. He says, when I was hungry, you fed me. He also says, when I was sick, you looked after me. And what he means by that is he means that we must treat everybody as if they were Jesus. We must show love to everybody just as we would show love to Jesus. And he says that the people who do this are considered sheep and they'll be rewarded. The people that don't do this are considered goats and they will be punished. These will go to eternal punishment. So if we're thinking about why Jesus is a good example of how to follow, of how to behave, we must look at this parable of the sheep and the goats and look at this idea of judgment. We will be judged on how we behave, and the parable of the sheep and the goats clearly says if we want to be rewarded and avoid eternal punishment, we must treat everyone as if they are Jesus by doing things such as feeding the hungry and looking after the sick. So the next way that Jesus helps us with our morality and how we should behave and how we should treat other people is this idea of servanthood. And Jesus is referred to as the servant king. And what this means is that as a servant would, they would put other people first. And Jesus does this quite noticeably at the Last Supper. The Last Supper, which was just a few hours before he was crucified. And he had the meal with his apostles, his 12 apostles, and after the meal he washed their feet. And it was quite an unusual thing for this to happen. If you think about these two words, servant, king, you wouldn't expect a king to be behaving as a servant. They don't quite match. This is a bit of a oxymoron. This is a bit of an oxymoron. So Jesus, he washes their feet, and it's this idea of putting other people's needs first, not thinking of your own. And this kind of example is really, it's a bit of a precursor to what was to come a few hours later, when Jesus sort of had the ultimate show of servanthood and the ultimate sacrificial love when he was crucified and he died to save humanity. This sacrificial love is called agape. So when we're talking about how we should behave, we should be looking at this idea of being a servant to others and putting other people's needs first rather than our own. The final example, there's many examples, but the final one that you need to know for the exam is that Jesus taught a lot about forgiveness. And if we want to know how to treat other people, forgiveness needs to be a big part of that. Jesus' last words when he was crucified were, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And we can look at this to mean many different things, and that's from Luke. We can look at this to mean different things, but really he's kind of just saying, God, forgive humanity. And if we're looking at how we should behave, if we're expecting God to forgive us, then we have to show forgiveness to other people. There were many parables that Jesus spoke about encouraging the idea of forgiveness, and the main kind of message is that forgiveness will bring about salvation. If we as human beings want to be saved by God and want to reach atonement with God, want to be with God, we must show forgiveness to other people. We cannot expect God to forgive us if we're not willing to forgive others. Now, this should help you with some of the tasks that have been set for you on how we should be making moral decisions and how we should be looking at the example of Jesus as the incarnation of God and everything he did in his life to help us in our lives. Now, is this relevant today? We can look at the Bible, we can read all this. Do we think it's relevant today? Well, if we're talking about loving our neighbour, and we're talking about treating other people as we would like to be treated, and we're thinking about looking after the sick and the hungry, I think there's no other time when it's been more important to follow these teachings. You must stay home, protect the NHS and save lives. If we do that, we are really putting the teachings of Jesus into practice.